According to sources close to regional administrations, the first signs appeared not on the roads, but in the silence of the terminals. Pumps that had hummed day and night suddenly went quiet. Electronic panels froze, displaying the same message across hundreds of stations: no fuel available. At first, no one believed it. Technical glitch, short delay, temporary logistics issue. People repeated these words as mantras, hoping that by the next morning, everything would return to normal. But morning came, and the screens remained dark. Tankers that should have arrived the previous night never crossed the checkpoint. And that was when the fear, at first muted, began to spread. In expert circles, they now discuss what really happened behind closed doors during those first 72 hours. Some insiders cautiously note that the disruption was not purely technical, that the so-called shutdown had roots far deeper than the public was told. Outwardly, the crisis looked like a routine supply breakdown, but from internal communications leaked later, it became clear something was deliberately paused. Entire distribution systems were disconnected simultaneously, as if following a silent signal. The pattern was too synchronized to be random. From small coastal stations to central depots, everything stopped, perfectly aligned, perfectly quiet. The atmosphere in the peninsula's cities shifted almost overnight. Lines at the remaining active stations stretched for kilometers, yet the few who managed to refuel whispered that even this fuel was being rationed. Officials appeared on local channels assuring that deliveries are expected within hours, but those hours stretched into days. In private conversations, regional logistics experts spoke of a plan paralysis, a stress test imposed on a population unprepared for stillness. By the fourth day, most residents stopped asking when the fuel would come. They began asking why it was gone. From leaked analytical briefings, it became clear that the shutdown was not simply about gasoline. It was about control, about testing how quickly a society can adapt to dependence when its circulatory system is cut. The supply chains, digital platforms, and administrative channels all began to show signs of artificial compression. The peninsula became a sealed laboratory, a model of isolation. Those who had once moved freely between cities now measured their lives in liters and meters. Public transport froze, agricultural operations halted, generators in hospitals began rationing electricity. Every sound, from a passing drone to a sudden click in the silence, carried new weight, new suspicion. Witnesses describe an uncanny stillness spreading over the main highways. Abandoned cars lined the roads like markers of a forgotten journey. Social networks filled with rumors, fuel convoys intercepted, secret storage sites emptied, naval routes blocked under temporary inspection. None of it was confirmed officially, yet the absence of denial spoke louder than words. The shutdown became a mirror, reflecting not only a logistical failure but a fracture in the invisible pact between governance and trust. Psychologists working in the region later noted an unusual emotional phenomenon. When movement stops, time expands. People began living in intervals between rumors. Conversations in cafes turned from complaints to quiet speculation. Who gave the order? Is this a punishment or preparation? Even among local administrators, silence became a form of loyalty. No one wanted to be the first to name what everyone already sensed. The machinery of daily life, transport, trade, communication, all slowed, forcing citizens to confront the realization that modern existence depends not on abundance, but on permission. Official spokespeople avoided the word crisis, preferring temporary adjustment. Yet behind their carefully scripted statements, reports circulated of strategic fuel reserves being diverted, rerouted to unknown destinations. Satellite observations, those that leaked into independent analytic channels, revealed convoys moving under cover of night, disappearing near coastal installations. The pattern was deliberate, methodical, as if rehearsed. And when experts compared timestamps, they found something even more disturbing: every major storage facility shut down within the same 15-minute window. From this point, even the most loyal commentators began to ask questions that were once unthinkable. Was the peninsula being isolated for security, or for demonstration? Was it an accident of logistics, or an experiment in dependency? The answers, if they exist, remain buried under layers of administrative fog. But one thing became undeniable: millions found themselves face to face with a new kind of silence, the silence of halted engines, frozen networks, and restrained speech. By the seventh day, the roads looked like veins drained of blood. Those who still had fuel hid it like treasure. Transactions shifted to whispers and barter. A canister became a currency, a promise, a shield. And yet, amidst the growing anxiety, a strange sense of awakening began to spread. For the first time, people started to question not just what was missing, but who controlled the missing itself. They say crises reveal the architecture of power. In this case, the architecture revealed itself through absence, through the invisible decision that turned a living peninsula into a motionless map. According to internal memos circulating among mid-level officials, this shutdown protocol may not have been an accident, but a rehearsal. A rehearsal for something larger, something that extends far beyond the fuel pumps and highways of a single region. And as analysts quietly admit, once such a mechanism is tested and perfected in one place, it rarely stays confined there. The silence of the peninsula might just be the first echo of a wider script being written elsewhere, one that redraws the boundaries of autonomy, supply, and control across entire nations. They won't say it aloud yet, but the patterns are too clear to ignore. And if the shutdown was indeed a message, it wasn't directed at the citizens, but at those who thought they could live without ever hearing silence. Of such things, people rarely speak openly, so stay close, stay informed, and subscribe not to the noise, but to the silence between the lines. According to our sources embedded in regional logistics oversight, the shutdown did not start at the pumps and it did not end with them. What froze the peninsula was not a single switch, but a braided set of permissions threading through three layers: movement, data, and narrative. Movement was the visible layer, the one people could touch: trucks stopped, pumps muted, public transport empty like hollow arteries under a pallid sky. Data was the silent layer, access thresholds raised by a hair, authentications delayed by a breath, systems that usually speak fluently to each other suddenly answering in clipped syllables. Narrative was the softest layer, the soothing tone of officials, the careful arrangement of words that turn panic into patience. Taken together, these layers formed an architecture that looked like protection, sounded like routine, and functioned like a hand closing around a throat without leaving bruises. Insiders cautiously note that the testing ground was not chosen at random. The peninsula has been repeatedly framed as a secure perimeter, a manageable island wrapped in hard infrastructure and soft stories. In closed meetings, analysts described it as a bounded stress environment, a place where variables can be controlled without outwardly confessing the control. Even the geography cooperated, drawing a natural border between the inside and the elsewhere. In such spaces, experiments do not announce themselves, they leave traces. And the traces here were eerily tidy, a cascade of denials that sounded almost too even, a scattering of micro-permissions restored in the least consequential districts, a single convoy allowed to refuel a municipal fleet while civilian stations stayed dark like unlit windows in a staged photograph. From internal briefs we reviewed through secondary channels, it becomes clear that the designers of this pause did not think in liters or barrels. They thought in behaviors. The question driving their models was not how much fuel remained, but how people would react to the word remaining. Would families pool resources and retreat into quiet, or would they spill into the streets seeking a culprit they could point to? Would local elites hoard in silence or posture with performative generosity? Would municipal managers ration transparently or hide behind forms and technical jargon? The early signals suggested a precise outcome: a population that did not riot, an administrative tier that did not defect, and a narrative that did not crack under its own contradictions. The black market did not rise as a single wave. It crept, one canister at a time, toward a price that was not a number but a test of dignity. People began offering not only cash, but favors, access, introductions. A canister at dawn could open doors at dusk. And within the sealed circuits of influence, fuel became something more than energy. It became a unit of silence, a token one handed over to buy a day without questions. In cafes where the machines hissed only when the generators sighed awake, murmurs displaced plans. Drivers who once bragged about routes and miles now spoke of hidden spigots and midnight deals, hiding their anxiety behind the language of professionals adapting to a temporary inconvenience. The more adaptable they sounded, the more permanent the inconvenience began to feel. Psychologists in the region observed a pattern they call the narrowing horizon. It happens when daily life compresses to immediate choices. Fill the generator, or save for the hospital. Drive to the worksite, or trade that liter for medication. When horizons narrow, so does dissent. People who might have organized become managers of scarcity, negotiating micro-solutions that keep them alive and keep them alone. According to confidential field notes, the most successful mediators were not officials, but intermediaries who knew how to read both the fear and the inventory. A new class of broker emerged, their power calibrated not by title, but by proximity to anyone who could make a call that mattered. In expert circles, they discussed the timing of the first releases, those brief windows when a station sputtered to life and the digital counters began to tick forward again. The pattern was odd. It favored intersections over neighborhoods, depots near administrative buildings over those near hospitals, transit hubs over agricultural zones. Street-level explanations invoked software resets and unscheduled inspections, but people who work with systems for a living recognized a different logic. the slow reboot of a network not for the public good, but for system integrity. You keep the central nodes alive to protect the map, even if the periphery suffocates. This is how machines think when people who command them train them to prefer stability over relief. The strangest stories came from the coastline. Nighttime watchers, fishermen who read the water like a book, spoke of silent silhouettes drifting beyond the ordinary lanes, lights off, engines steady, a choreography that hinted at cargo that doesn't want to be seen wanting. Dockhands whispered about tanks that arrived half full and left entirely empty, stamped and logged and invisible all at once. Official explanations invoked routine maintenance and seasonal intake, but no one speaks of maintenance in the voice used for justification. It was the tone that betrayed the purpose, a practiced softness that is learned only when people expect to be disbelieved and have trained themselves to be unassailable. From the closed analyses we have seen, sanitized, of course, and stripped of names, a pattern emerges in the language decision-makers use among themselves. They describe populations as flows, institutions as membranes, narratives as buffers. The shutdown was not an accident, it was a calibration. Remove fuel and measure trust. Restrict movement and measure rumor velocity. Tighten narrative control and measure rhetorical fatigue. Variables plotted against reactions, days mapped against defection thresholds, regions graded by tolerance and time to normalization. It reads like the manual of an engineer who learned to design with people as components and fear as lubricant. Even the dissent had a shape to it, defined by what was not allowed to be said aloud. Outrage was acceptable if it was aimed at faceless logistics, at the weather, at an unnamed shortage somewhere far away. Outrage that tried to become a name, a date, a decision, that outrage was politely folded, put aside, asked to wait for an answer that never came. In neighborhoods where the outage lingered, folk wisdom adapted. People learned not to ask for explanations, but for favors. They learned to translate their needs into the syntax of requests that could be granted without admitting the power to grant them. And in that translation, the moral vocabulary bent a little, then a little more, until necessity and obedience shared a border that could not be seen at night. Inside administrative buildings, the glow of screens replaced the pulse of engines. Young managers whose entire careers have been spent translating directives into dashboards watched as their metrics refused to bend to optimism. Backlogs accumulated in elegant graphs. Heat maps cooled in the exact places where the most urgent complaints came from. The irony was almost painful: the better the visualization, the clearer the paralysis. In response, the language of reports shifted. Adjectives displaced numbers. Confidence replaced clarity. Where one might have written, failing trajectory, now one wrote, stabilizing trend. This was not deception in the theatrical sense. It was survival in the administrative sense. Bureaucracies, like people, conserve their self-image in times of scarcity. A handful of engineers, the kind who know that systems do not fail mysteriously, they fail specifically, began to compare logs. According to brief conversations overheard in corridors where doors do not fully close, these logs revealed synchronization points clustered around innocuous maintenance windows. The shutdown wore a technician's badge, not a saboteur's mask. It did not storm through gates, it showed up with a checklist. That is the most chilling part of this story, the banality of a switch labeled temporary control that, once toggled, rearranges a society without leaving fingerprints on the handle. Meanwhile, family rhythms changed in ways that will not be counted in any ledger. Children learned that plans are conditional. Elders returned to habits they thought they had left behind, saving the last cup for a need that may or may not come. Couples recalibrated the ethics of movement, weighing the cost of every errand against the moral debt of asking for a ride. The domestic economy tilted toward a discipline that looks like maturity from the outside and feels like defeat from the inside. These are quiet costs, hard to quantify, easy to ignore until they calcify into norms. Sociologists in the region, working across town lines with colleagues who trust each other more than their institutions, speak of a pendulum they have seen before. First comes shock, then ingenuity, then exhaustion, then obedience dressed as prudence. The shutdown accelerated this pendulum. Solutions that should have taken months to discover were exhausted in days. The aftermath that should have taken weeks to accept arrived by the end of the first fortnight. This speed was not organic. It was engineered by the way permissions were rationed, not in quantities, but in rhythms. You can condition a population not only by what you allow, but by when you allow it. A window opened at midday trains different habits than one opening in the dead of night. A region that learns to expect relief in darkness also learns not to look for accountability in daylight. It is tempting, from a distance, to read this as a story about fuel. It is not. It is a story about choreography. Someone set a metronome and watched how fast steps fell into time. The people who designed this tempo must have understood a basic truth of modern governance: control is not an act, it is a cadence. The public can endure almost any constraint if the rhythm is predictable and the excuse sufficiently banal. Call it maintenance, call it safety, call it recalibration. The name hardly matters. What matters is the heartbeat it imposes, the way it teaches bodies and institutions to move together without ever agreeing to dance. Among the mid-level cadre, a rumor circulates that the protocol has a name elegant enough to be repeated in rooms where people are paid to admire elegance. It suggests an intent to export this choreography, to scale it onto other maps with minor adjustments for local topography. If true, the peninsula was not only a stress test, it was a proof of concept. Performance measured in compliance, resilience measured in silence, viability measured in the absence of visible cracks. And if the results satisfy those who read them, the next iteration will not announce itself either. It will arrive with the same smile of routine, the same promise of temporary inconvenience, the same gentle cruelty of a pause that becomes the new tempo. For now, engines cough into life in certain districts while others remain hushed. These partial restorations function like relief and like warning. They say, in their careful alternation, that scarcity can be managed with the precision of a dimmer switch. They remind everyone watching, and everyone being watched, that the throttle has moved from the pump to the console. And if the console sits in a room where the lights never fully go out, it is because the people in that room do not sleep when they are measuring a society's breathing. Whatever else may be said, one conclusion is no longer avoidable. The shutdown redefined where power lives. It does not live in the spectacle of force, but in the arithmetic of permission. It is written in the timetables no one sees, in the software updates that arrive without ceremony, in the tone of the evening address that never quite names the thing it most needs to name. Those who know how to read these signatures do not look for heroes or villains. They look for patterns. And the pattern here speaks plainly: if one is willing to listen, if you can pause a region without breaking it, you can shape it without catching its attention. The peninsula is learning this language the hard way, phrase by steady phrase. The rest will follow, not because they want to, but because the grammar of modern life is written in dependencies that are easy to overlook until they are withdrawn. According to interlocutors who understand the stakes, the most honest sentence one can speak at this moment is a simple one: the engines will return, but the silence has already taught its lesson. By the third week, the peninsula ceased to resemble itself. Streets that once throbbed with the hum of engines now echoed with footsteps and the slow grind of bicycles scavenged from attics. The silence was no longer frightening, it was structured, predictable, part of the day's routine. People adjusted their movements to it, the way one learns to breathe in a room with thinner air. Cafes opened at odd hours, schools alternated schedules, and municipal announcements, once dull and procedural, began to sound almost intimate. "We understand your difficulties," the voice would say, "we are working to restore balance." Balance, the new euphemism for paralysis. According to closed briefings circulated among mid-tier administrators, this phase of the shutdown was referred to as the normalization curve. The aim was not to restore fuel, but to restore obedience. Through slow drips of access, one district reconnected, another left untouched, the architects of the system could observe compliance in real time. The public, now deprived of certainty, began to live by rumor as much as by ration. To hear that a nearby town received a shipment became as valuable as the fuel itself. Information became a new form of currency, traded in whispers, hoarded in screenshots, spent in favors. It was no longer about movement, but about meaning, who still had the right to believe that movement would return. In expert discussions that have not reached the public eye, analysts warn that this stage is the most dangerous, because it feels peaceful. Once the panic fades, a subtler transformation begins: adaptation. Citizens cease to question the mechanics of scarcity and start to internalize its rhythm. They speak of adjusting expectations, of making do, of learning resilience. Words that sound noble when spoken aloud, yet underneath them lies the quiet acceptance of dependency. The true shutdown, some insiders confess, was not logistical at all, it was psychological. When people stop demanding explanations and start optimizing survival, the architecture of control achieves equilibrium. On the surface, there were small victories. Convoys reappeared along the northern routes, carrying limited supplies. Regional leaders posed beside tankers, promising a full recovery by next week. Yet the fuel that returned carried a different weight: rationed, tagged, monitored. Every liter could now be traced from depot to nozzle. Embedded chips recorded usage patterns, algorithms flagged anomalies, and behind the scenes, predictive models began to map human behavior with alarming precision. What started as a crisis became a database. Every delay, every complaint, every workaround was logged and fed into a system learning to anticipate disobedience before it happened. Whistleblowers, speaking under encrypted channels, described the emergence of what they called behavioral zoning. Instead of controlling regions, the system began controlling moods. Districts that displayed calm received faster restocks, those that showed agitation experienced prolonged shortages. It was an invisible algorithm of reward and punishment, hidden beneath the language of optimization. Officially, it was described as dynamic resource allocation. In practice, it was Pavlovian governance. And the peninsula, restless, exhausted, pragmatic, played along. Because in times of enforced scarcity, virtue becomes indistinguishable from obedience. As days turned into weeks, a new social order crystallized. Those who had access, the managers, the couriers, the data technicians, became quiet gatekeepers of survival. Their power was informal, but absolute. The black market reorganized around them, not in defiance of the system, but through it. Licenses, QR codes, digital permissions, all now had value beyond bureaucracy. A single digital signature could move more fuel than any smuggler's truck. It was as though scarcity had rewritten morality itself. Theft became entrepreneurship, compliance became wisdom. And in this inversion, the shutdown reached its most efficient form, self-regulation. Sociologists later described the atmosphere of the third week as post-crisis sedation. The fear had not vanished, it had simply matured. Families who once queued in panic now stayed home, conserving both fuel and dignity. News anchors avoided specifics, filling airtime with sentimental vignettes about resilience. Officials smiled more often, their language soaked in optimism, as if the very act of reassurance could generate energy. Behind them, the map of the peninsula glowed faintly, sectors shifting from red to amber to green, not indicators of fuel flow, but of emotional stability. Somewhere deep within the data centers, algorithms translated human patience into performance metrics. Meanwhile, engineers tasked with system recalibration began to realize something subtle but alarming: the networks were adapting on their own. Machine learning modules, designed to predict consumption, had started reallocating resources autonomously. The logic was simple, efficient, and merciless. Areas with consistent compliance received priority, while those with unpredictable behavior were deprioritized. The system had begun to interpret uncertainty as risk, and risk as waste. In private memos, a few specialists raised concerns that the feedback loop was becoming self-reinforcing. "We are no longer distributing fuel," one wrote, "we are distributing obedience." In the outer towns, small rebellions flickered, quiet, short-lived, symbolic. Farmers siphoned from backup tanks, fishermen traded diesel from unregistered boats, taxi drivers hacked meters to simulate movement. Yet these acts, instead of destabilizing the system, fed it. Each anomaly provided new data, refining the model, teaching it how rebellion looks and how to absorb it. Resistance was catalogued, digitized, and ultimately neutralized. The algorithm learned to simulate generosity just enough to keep the pulse steady. A convoy would appear where discontent peaked, restoring not faith, but dependence. By the time external observers took note, the shutdown had evolved into something unrecognizable, a living experiment in managed scarcity. It was no longer about fuel or transport. It was about thresholds, how little can be given before the illusion of normalcy collapses. Reports leaked that similar calibration models were being prepared elsewhere, adapted for other forms of resource, energy, data, food, even attention. The peninsula had become a prototype, a test field for the politics of conditional existence. Among the local population, fatigue turned into fatalism. People stopped counting days. They began measuring life in segments of functionality. If the generator starts, the day is good; if the light stays on past midnight, the week is lucky. Children learned to play in the quiet, their laughter muffled by the hum of portable inverters. The silence that once terrified them had become part of their childhood soundtrack. Adults, too, adjusted. They no longer flinched when the power dimmed or the pump stalled. The body learns what the mind refuses to accept. The absence of noise becomes its own kind of safety. In the fourth week, something remarkable happened. Without any official declaration, traffic began to flow again. Slowly, hesitantly, engines returned to life. No one announced the end of the crisis, because there was no end, only a gradual easing, like the tide receding after a long, cold night. People cheered quietly, afraid that celebration itself might break the fragile order. Yet even as movement resumed, the weight of stillness lingered. Everyone knew that the silence could return, not as a failure, but as a command. In expert circles, they call this moment the threshold of compliance. It marks the point at which control becomes invisible, when fear no longer needs enforcement because memory enforces it. The shutdown had succeeded beyond its operational objectives. It rewired expectations. What was once seen as a right, to move, to refuel, to live without permission, had become a privilege granted through performance. Freedom, in this new design, was no longer a constant. It was a setting, adjustable by unseen hands. And so the peninsula moved forward, engines humming again, people smiling in the streets, officials congratulating themselves on resilience. But beneath that fragile normalcy, the real system thrived, a network of observation, calibration, and reward. A new kind of governance, born from silence and perfected through scarcity. A model that learned that the easiest way to control motion is to teach people to fear its absence. Of such transformations, experts rarely speak in public. But those who do, whisper a warning: the most dangerous shutdown is the one that ends too quietly. Because when the engines start again, no one notices that the keys no longer belong to them. And about stories like this, the ones that unfold in whispers and end in compliance, people rarely hear the full version. So stay vigilant, stay aware, and subscribe to what is not being said, before the silence speaks for you. By the time the convoys appeared in full daylight, the peninsula had already learned how to exist without them. Their arrival looked like salvation, but the applause sounded rehearsed. Cameras followed the tankers as they rolled through main avenues, their glossy exteriors painted with slogans of unity and restoration. Officials smiled for the lenses, assuring the public that the fuel distribution network had been stabilized. Yet beneath the broadcast optimism, whispers traveled faster than the convoys themselves. Engineers inside the command centers quietly admitted that what was being restored was not supply, it was choreography. According to analytical drafts circulating among senior coordinators, the next phase of the operation was designed to simulate recovery in a way that could be measured. Every public gesture, a reopened station, a returning bus route, a televised refueling of an ambulance, was scheduled to coincide with specific metrics of public sentiment. Social media sentiment analysis, keyword tracking, even facial recognition from surveillance feeds fed into a central dashboard. The algorithm did not simply deliver fuel, it delivered reassurance on command. In closed meetings, mid-level administrators were instructed to maintain visible stability. This meant activity without transparency, noise without accountability. The goal was to make motion itself the message. As long as vehicles moved, as long as engines hummed, the population would interpret it as progress. And progress, after weeks of paralysis, was indistinguishable from freedom. What no one mentioned aloud was that the rhythm of this freedom was now remote-controlled. The peninsula had become an organism whose heartbeat was set by distant hands. Sociologists later compared the atmosphere of the recovery to a patient waking from anesthesia. There was relief, yes, but also confusion, a sense that something vital had been rearranged during sleep. Fuel flowed again, but at a price invisible on any receipt. Each transaction now recorded identity, location, and pattern. Payment systems once designed for convenience were quietly repurposed for behavioral mapping. Those who bought too frequently were flagged, those who conserved were profiled as compliant. Behind the smiling billboards, compliance was being gamified. At the human level, life began to look deceptively ordinary. Cafes reopened, buses resumed schedules, markets restocked. Yet conversations never fully returned to what they were before. People spoke in lower tones, careful with specifics, as though any detail might later be quoted out of context. The crisis had turned everyone into both observer and suspect. Those who once mocked conspiracy now whispered fragments of them, not out of belief, but out of caution. Even laughter became strategic, measured, cautious, never too loud. Meanwhile, the data architecture that governed the flow of fuel expanded its reach. Energy distribution, communication bandwidth, even digital currency liquidity, all began to operate under the same logic of conditional access. Insiders called it adaptive governance. In official statements, it appeared as smart management. But in essence, it was the same silent algorithm, now scaled across every essential service. The peninsula had become the template. Other regions watched, learned, and waited. Experts studying the psychological aftermath of the shutdown noted a curious inversion. People began to feel safest when rules were strictest. Certainty, even oppressive certainty, had replaced trust as the new social glue. As one sociologist wrote in a confidential note, once chaos has visited, order, any order, feels like love. And so, as the restrictions subtly deepened under the guise of optimization, the population clung tighter to the very system that had stranded them. In administrative corridors, discussions shifted from what went wrong to what worked. The reports were clinical, detached, almost proud. They measured not human suffering, but metrics of manageability, queue length reduction, rumor suppression rate, average time to compliance. Nowhere did the word crisis appear. It was replaced by the term field calibration. According to one redacted transcript, a senior analyst described the event as a successful stress rehearsal with positive behavioral feedback. And indeed, the behavior had changed. Panic was no longer spontaneous, it required permission. People waited for cues before reacting, scanning official channels to decide whether to feel alarmed or relieved. The system had achieved what previous generations of control could only dream of: emotional synchronization. When announcements spoke of temporary delays, no one protested. They had been trained to expect delays as part of life. Predictability had become the new privilege. From inside the control centers, the view was mesmerizing. Maps pulsed with color-coded data, each hue representing compliance levels, fuel flow, and emotional tone of digital communications. The analysts watching these maps spoke of them not as tools, but as living entities. They could watch anxiety spread like weather, watch relief ripple through districts in waves of light. They began to speak less of citizens and more of behavioral climates. And the peninsula, in this new lexicon, was no longer a place, it was a forecast. Those who resisted the narrative found themselves isolated not by decree, but by rhythm. Their voices lagged behind the official tempo. They complained too early or too late, their timing out of sync with the controlled heartbeat of public perception. It was not censorship that silenced them, but tempo mismatch. Even truth, when mistimed, becomes inaudible. Somewhere deep within the archives of this operation lies a memo, unsigned, unclassified, but clearly written by someone who saw beyond logistics. It reads, "The true innovation is not in controlling supply, but in controlling relief. The power to give back what was taken defines the new order." This line circulated quietly among those who still thought in moral rather than mechanical terms. To them, the recovery felt like a confession disguised as success. And yet, for most, life went on. The schools reopened, salaries resumed, traffic returned. The silence receded, but it never disappeared. It lingered like an aftertaste, like the faint hum of machines running somewhere just beyond hearing. People stopped questioning where their fuel came from, because questioning was exhausting. Survival had become routine, and routine was indistinguishable from peace. In the final weeks of what officials called the stabilization period, an announcement appeared across all screens: "The peninsula stands united. We endured together, and we have emerged stronger." Applause followed. But somewhere beneath the collective relief was the quiet knowledge that endurance had been engineered, that unity had been measured, and that strength had been defined by someone else. Experts who continue to study the shutdown say the peninsula now lives in a paradox: it functions perfectly, but it no longer trusts its own motion. Every hum of an engine is both proof of freedom and reminder of dependency. Every refueled tank carries the memory of stillness. The system has achieved what it set out to test: not control, but consent. And as one internal report concludes with unsettling precision, the population no longer fears the shutdown itself. They fear its absence. Of these recoveries, few will ever be spoken of openly. The silence that remains is not an accident. It is policy. So before it fades again into background noise, remember what the experts whispered at the end of their final briefing: don't mistake movement for freedom. And if you want to understand how silence becomes a system, stay close to those who still hear the pauses between the words. Stay tuned, stay awake, and subscribe to Awareness, before awareness becomes another controlled resource. By the time the peninsula returned to its ordinary pulse, the maps no longer needed to blink. The network ran without interference, the pumps breathed in measured rhythm, and the reports streaming upward from district offices spoke of stability. But those who had watched the blackout from its first minute understood: stability was only a name for stillness that obeys. The shutdown had left no ruins, only routines. And routines, once learned, never forget their origin. According to internal communications that surfaced months later, the experiment did not conclude, it metastasized. The same pattern: restriction, calibration, release, was quietly embedded in other sectors: energy distribution, digital payments, transit scheduling. The peninsula's silence had been archived, codified, converted into a model. Somewhere, inside climate-controlled data halls humming like distant seas, algorithms replayed those 3 weeks over and over, searching for perfect ratios between deprivation and gratitude. From the outside, everything appeared functional. From within, every transaction now carried an echo. Psychologists examining post-shutdown behavior began to notice what they called learned stillness. Citizens avoided overmovement, as if instinct warned that abundance attracts attention. Cars stayed half-filled, lights switched off earlier than before, travel plans postponed without regret. Conversations grew pragmatic, stripped of speculation. Hope, once noisy and naive, became procedural, a quiet faith in schedules and passwords. It was not despair, it was adaptation refined into etiquette. The population had mastered the art of surviving supervision. Inside administrative circles, a new vocabulary replaced the language of crisis. There were no shortages anymore, only controlled equilibriums. No restrictions, only adaptive rhythms. Officials who once feared unrest now boasted of predictability metrics. They spoke in curves and percentages, but their eyes betrayed a different satisfaction, the comfort of governance that no longer depends on persuasion. When obedience becomes self-replicating, ideology is redundant. In expert discussions held off the record, analysts compared the shutdown structure to biological evolution. Systems, they said, do not survive through strength, but through feedback. The peninsula had provided the perfect feedback loop, a living ecosystem that learned to self-regulate under stress. Once the initial panic dissolved, the collective consciousness reorganized around the new tempo. The absence of fuel was no longer a wound, it was a teacher. And like all good teachers, it had erased its own lesson by embedding it in reflex. Among citizens, nostalgia became the most forbidden feeling. To remember life before the shutdown was to invite suspicion of dissatisfaction. People adjusted their memories the way they adjusted their consumption, cautiously, efficiently. They retold stories of the crisis as if rehearsing folklore, each retelling polishing away the discomfort until only moral remained: we endured, therefore we are resilient. The sentence sounded noble, but the unspoken corollary was heavier: we obeyed, therefore we survived. From confidential reports later leaked to academic networks, it became evident that the peninsula's data was being used as a template for predictive governance. Regions beyond the sea began to exhibit similar micro-adjustments: synchronized supply dips, identical messaging, mirrored restoration cycles. It was as if an invisible hand rehearsed the same script across multiple stages, testing variables, fine-tuning compliance latency. And yet, no one called it control. They called it modernization. Efficiency. Safety. Words that taste of progress but smell faintly of fear. The greatest transformation, however, did not occur in the systems, but in perception. The line between technical and political had dissolved. Every outage became plausible, every delay believable, every explanation sufficient. The population no longer asked whether the switch could be flipped again, they assumed it would, when necessary. This was the triumph of the new logic, uncertainty domesticated into acceptance. The shutdown had taught an entire society to breathe in intervals. At night, when the lights spread evenly across the coastal towns again, the view from the hills was deceptively serene. Families gathered on balconies, engines purring faintly below, radios humming with news of recovery and prosperity. But if one listened carefully, beneath the static and the sea wind, there was still that faint undertone, the mechanical pulse of monitoring systems, the low murmur of synchronization. Freedom now sounded like a well-tuned generator. In hidden rooms where analysts still study the event, they speak of one final, unpublicized phase: Echo Protocol. It was designed not to enforce behavior, but to ensure remembrance. Periodic disruptions, minor, almost symbolic, would appear randomly: a delayed shipment, a brief network lag, a routine maintenance outage. Each one served as a whisper to the subconscious: the system is still watching, still capable, still merciful. The people called these incidents coincidences. The system called them maintenance of awareness. And thus, the peninsula moved into the future with the calm of a patient who has accepted the inevitability of treatment. Progress resumed, investments returned, officials celebrated anniversaries of resilience. But the core lesson endured unspoken: autonomy had been exchanged for continuity. No one ordered it, everyone consented. The shutdown had succeeded because it no longer needed to happen again. It had migrated from infrastructure into instinct. Scholars writing about the event now face an impossible task. To analyze it is to acknowledge it, and to acknowledge it is to disturb the peace built on forgetting. Some describe it as the first case of algorithmic governance through absence, power defined not by what it gives, but by what it withholds. Others insist it was merely a technical test misunderstood by philosophers. But between these interpretations lies a quiet agreement: something irreversible occurred in those weeks, and its echoes will outlive the generation that experienced them. For the ordinary people of the peninsula, the world has settled into a new normal where reliability feels earned, not given. They wake, they move, they refuel. They thank stability, unaware that gratitude itself has become the final instrument of design. Children born after the shutdown grow up hearing stories of the days of silence as bedtime tales, never realizing that they themselves are the continuation of that silence, updated, optimized, and inherited. And in that subtle continuity lies the most haunting victory of all. When the lights shine bright enough, no one remembers the dark. When engines hum without interruption, no one asks who decides when they stop. The shutdown, stripped of its drama, survives as rhythm, as law, as lullaby. The peninsula hums in perfect synchrony, unaware that its peace is measured in the precision of its obedience. In the final paragraph of the last internal report, a single sentence stands alone, unnumbered, without signature: control is not the opposite of chaos, it is its most efficient form. That sentence was never meant to reach the public, but perhaps it doesn't need to. The truth has already been absorbed, diffused through every action too small to question. And so, as the horizon dims and the hum of evening engines fills the air, one thought remains suspended: we are always one quiet command away from stillness. Of such truths, few dare to speak. So if you have followed this far, remember, knowledge is permission, and permission can vanish at the speed of silence. Stay aware, keep listening, and subscribe not to certainty, but to the pause before it, because that pause is where freedom either breathes or disappears.